One of the most frustrating paradoxes in the ball python breeding hobby deals with how do you pick your initial projects? Because if you choose projects that are super popular and have a ton of hype in them, generally speaking, those projects will have a crash and will likely not be anywhere near the value that you bought into them at once you are able to produce babies in them. And on the inverse, people all the time say that you should find your own spin, your own unique way to make a name for yourself in the ball python breeding hobby. But when new breeders try to find the underworked genes, oftentimes those underworked genes have a specific reason why they're not very popular, and buying into them is going to set you up for disaster later on. So the paradox comes in is if you're not supposed to look at the super popular projects and the underworked genes tend to have a reason why they are underworked, how can a new ball python breeder pick a project that will set them up well later on that isn't going to be something that everybody else is doing? For this week's video, we are going to be diving into all of this in as much nuance as we can. My name's Steven with Leviathan, and let's get to it. For our first scenario, let's talk about the hyper-popular projects, because at any given time that somebody is getting into the ball python breeding hobby, there are going to be projects that have a ton of attention and a lot of interest from the breeding community. But if you buy into that project right then and there, you're likely going to be buying in when the prices are relatively the highest that they will ever be in that point going forward. And by the time that you are able to produce animals in that project, there's going to be a lot more supply in it, and the other people who are caught up in the hype have already also bought their animals, so they may not be looking to buy nearly as many in the future because they will also be producing their own. And all of these different factors when it comes to hyper popular projects tends to result in price crashes about 2 to 3 years after there is an initial wave of interest in a particular morph in a particular project. So in this particular scenario, if you were to buy in when the prices are, let's say, $10,000 for a specific combination or for a specific gene, by the time that you're able to produce babies in that project, maybe the exact same animal that was worth $10,000 is now worth $3,000. And this doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to recoup your money once you get a whole clutch of those animals, but it can feel really bad when the animal that you had bought for $10,000, which for most people is a lot of money, is now worth a third of what you had paid for it. So in this specific scenario, this doesn't mean that hyper popular projects are a bad thing, but it is a reality, and it's something that you are going to have to be ready for when it comes time for you to produce babies in it. Second scenario is when a new breeder sees all of the hype for given projects and knows that they should not follow the crowd because they don't want to be caught up in that price crash 2 to 3 years later. And instead, they find a morph that has maybe 10, 20, or 30 different animals on Morph Market, and it seems like almost nobody is working that morph. And they end up buying into that project, but they may not know the entire history around it or potential reasons why there's barely anybody working that specific project. So this is not something that is groundbreaking, but one of the best examples of this that I can give is the scaleless project. At first, we didn't know that the fully scaleless animals weren't really viable due to all of the extra care that they need and tend to very often not make it into adulthood. And what's more, because these animals have such a hard time thriving in captivity, because again, they just simply aren't set up for it without having any skills at all, there is essentially a dead end, because once you make that fully scaleless animal, you pretty much can't breed it. I'm not saying that they're sterile, it's just that they don't live long enough in order to breed in most cases. If a new breeder were to come in and see that there are barely any scaleless animals compared to clowns or pieds or desert ghosts, they may think that they are going to make scaleless the center point of their ball python breeding strategy. But if they invest big into scaleless right now, they likely are not going to do well at all. And when it comes time for them actually producing babies in that project, they aren't going to sell very well, and they aren't going to sell for very much money, and it will end up making that newer breeder, who has essentially gone through all of the steps but set themselves up incorrectly in the beginning, get jaded on the hobby and end up getting out. With these two scenarios in mind, we want to understand what is a way for a new ball python breeder to identify an underworked gene, but it isn't because there is health complications or maybe some controversy on whether or not that gene is the same as another gene or anything like this. And the very first thing that I think that anybody should do is they should look at all of the combos for that given morph, the ones that already exist, and find directions and find combinations that are objectively beautiful, where you can look at that combination, you can look at that gene and be like, that looks amazing to me. And that doesn't mean that everybody in the ball python hobby likes it, but if you like the appearance of it, that is going to give you the intrinsic motivation that is going to be needed in order to persevere, because once you start working an unpopular gene, you 1000% are going to get a bunch of people telling you why your decision to work it is stupid and the wrong decision. Now, once you identify some of those underappreciated genes that stand out to you, what I think you should do is do all of the research that you can on that particular gene. You should look up how it was founded. Are there any other genes that look similar to it that might potentially be the same thing? And this is stuff that we have seen previously with the hurricane trick and blitz type of situation. It's something that happened with coral glow and banana. And because of this, I think that it is very, very common that genes were introduced to the market, but actually were a gene that already existed. And the reason why there are barely any animals with that underappreciated gene is that they are actually being labeled as the more popular version of it. So again, doing all of your research before you buy into that underappreciated gene will likely let you know if there is any specific situations where you might not be buying a brand new gene and instead are just buying a rebranded gene of something that already exists. The next tip that I think that you should have is you should 1000% know exactly what the gene looks like in its single gene form, in its super form, if it has a super form, and in several other basic combinations. You should know what that underappreciated gene looks like with pastel or with Mojave or with yellow belly, because you are going to need that ground level basic understanding of this underworked gene in order to really promote it to everybody else in the hobby who has been sleeping on it up until this point. This ties into the idea that if there are not very many combos that are publicly available for this gene, it means that in order to get the gene to catch on, you are going to have to do the work because you can't rely on other people working that project for you. So if you are not set up to work a bunch of other random genes into this underappreciated one, it's going to be a situation where you are producing babies with that gene, and they might be amazing babies, but you aren't going to be easily able to show the progression of the gene and get people hyped for that project, because people in the ball python hobby tend to not buy into things that they don't understand, even if the animals are absolutely beautiful. Now, once you've done all of this, it is imperative that you market the gene and you market the project. And when you start doing this, when you start publicly putting it out there that you love this underappreciated gene, that it is the centerpiece of your ball python breeding strategy, you are going to get people telling you that you are an idiot. And again, this is why it's so important why you love the appearance yourself, because you are going to need that to not only refute them, but keep up motivation for it. Because if you are not able to keep keep up motivation, and if the haters are able to sway you from actually loving the gene, it's very likely that you are going to abandon that project before you get anywhere near the point that you are actually making a difference in it. While it might sound like I don't think that it's a good thing that people are hating a project, I actually think that it is the haters that are the most important piece of the underappreciated genes. Because if you have everybody being neutral to a gene, and as you promote it and as you market it, you are able to win people over, eventually it will go into a situation where nobody's hating it and everybody's loving it, and then it can create a situation where a bunch of people buy in all at once, and unless you are set up to really take advantage of that, there may not be a lot of interest by the time that you are able to produce babies in it, because everybody already bought what they wanted to buy for that project. Instead, what the haters do is that they will dampen some of the interest. So that way, as people are hearing about the gene and they're getting different opinions on it, some of the people are convinced by what you're putting out, and other people are not, and they are turned off from the project. And then there's a third group that sits in the middle and they want to see more from it. And it's that group in the middle that is going to be really, really important later on, because as you are able to make more and more and more beautiful combos in that project, it is going to convince people in the middle that they do like it and they do want to get into it. And over time, it's going to create a steady trickle of people into that project. So therefore, the prices can still remain stable. And if there is enough interest over time, maybe those prices can even rise. I think that you can see this entire curve really, really well with the morph hypo, because previously it was one of the genes that were derided in the ball python hobby, because people felt that hypo didn't really add anything to an animal. But as we've moved into the multi-recessive projects, hypo goes so well with so many other morphs as an enhancing morphs, it has become a centerpiece for the multi-recessive projects. And with this, it has created a situation where the people who were sleeping on hypo before because it was being derided in the ball python hobby now need to buy into it, and a lot of those people have quite a bit of funds behind them because they were buying into things like Desert Ghost when Desert Ghost was at its peak, and now they want to buy hypo animals to add into their projects. Right now, if I were to predict a morph that this will happen to in probably 3 to 5 years, I actually think that it's pied. And I know a lot of people are both going to be aghast at the fact that I am implying that people don't like pied right now, because pieds are objectively beautiful. And there's also going to be people right now who are going to hear me saying that pied is going to have a big comeback 3 to 5 years from now and be like, you are stupid. There is a reason why it's not being worked at the high end side of breeding. And the reason why I think that pied is actually underappreciated and not necessarily a problematic gene is that the biggest criticism of pied is that it wipes out so much of the pattern that you can't really tell what other genes are in it once you go beyond essentially 2 incomplete dominant genes. And while this 1000% is a valid criticism of the pied project, there definitely are genes that you can layer into a pied project in order to increase the pattern, such as inchy or scrambler. And these different genes can allow you to get access to an entirely different color palette and an entirely different pattern that you essentially cannot get outside of the pied project. So what I think will likely end up happening is in 3 to 5 years, when there hasn't been very much stuff done with pied because it has gone in favor of puzzle and in clown, I think that there will be some absolutely insane, beautiful pied combos come out, and that people will realize that they have been kind of ignoring pied, they've been sleeping on pied later on, and that there will be a big rush to get back into the pied project. And another thing that I think helps the pied project a lot is that they are objectively some of the most beautiful ball pythons in the hobby and get so many people into the industry. So even though there might not be a big demand for pieds at the high end side of breeding right now, at the entry level, there is a ton of demand for pieds, and a ton of people decide to buy a ball python because they see a pied for the very first time. There likely are tons of genes in the ball python hobby that are underappreciated, and if a breeder comes in and unlocks the exact right combo, the exact right genes to put with it, they could explode. But it's not going to happen in a vacuum. Once you figure out exactly what works with a given combo, you have to be able to push it out to everybody in the hobby, because if people don't know that that combo is amazing, there's no way for their interest to get piqued, and there's no way that that project will continue to grow in the future. So you have to combine the animals with marketing in order to make sure that your vision is being realized by the entire hobby. Anyways, we hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe, and we will see you next week.